Who works out of both Madrid, Spain, and London, England. He's an analyst, prolific writer of books, an adherent of the Austrian school, and someone who really follows markets the way an analyst does as opposed to the way an academic economist might. So all that said, Daniel Lacalle, great to see you and welcome to the show today. How are you?
Very well. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Well,
Great
I see
pleasure.
over his shoulder there, his most recent book is called Freedom or Equality. It's just out on Amazon in 2020. It's really a book about markets and social cooperation. I'm sure a lot of our audience, Daniel, is like-minded when it comes to a libertarian worldview. I actually was given an early copy of this book by Daniel and allowed to write a blurb for it. Recommend it to people. It's available on Amazon, and it's a book about what Mises thought of as social cooperation, which is really all that markets are. And given everything that's going on in the world right now, it's something we could all use a little more of. So, Daniel, I want to start today with the big picture question, which everyone has on their minds, which is how bad is this? How bad do you think this really is? Are we looking at something that might be like the Great Depression of the 1930s, or are we hopefully looking at something that's more like the crash of 2008?
It is, in my opinion, it is going to be somewhere in between. It will not be like the 1930s depression because thankfully the economy globally is very interconnected. The ability of emerging markets, developed economies, and the different financial markets as well to interconnect are going to help a lot in the recovery. However, it is not going to be as sort of short-term as the 2008 crisis. And many people view the 2008 crisis as a very dramatic one, and rightly so. However, the problem of this one is that we have seen from governments that they have conducted one of the most dangerous experiments that anyone can decide to undertake, which is the complete shutdown of an economy. And we're showing that that creates much larger and long-term ramifications than what many would have expected, and definitely what governments expected. They were all betting on a V-shaped recovery that is further and further away as we gather more data.
So when we look at this, talking about governments in the West, let's say, and central banks in the West, there's sort of two things happening. One is that central banks are busy creating what they call liquidity. So we can talk a little bit about that. Governments and treasuries are busy creating what they call stimulus, which you and I might call spending. So you've got these two things happening. And of course, these are inflationary, not only in effect, but also in purpose by design. But at the same time, you have individuals, businesses, households shutting down, not consuming, not working, not producing. So that's very deflationary. So you have this sort of tension here between inflation and deflation, and people have a hard time understanding which is which and how they can occur maybe simultaneously. Give us your thoughts.
Yes, as you very well say, it is very dangerous to implement inflationary measures in a lockdown. Why? Because what governments and central banks are trying to achieve is to stimulate a demand that is not going to be there because we're all at home. And because there was no problem of demand previously. It is not an issue like in 2008 of lack of access to credit or an issue of lack of access to debt from households, etc. It is simply, literally, what starts as a supply shock is included with the lockdown, complete lockdown decided by governments, and then central banks and governments try to stimulate a demand that is not there, and that the little demand that they're going to generate is actually not going to be followed by supply because many supply chains have been broken already. As such, in my opinion, we run the risk of seeing first a wave of massive deflation in CPI, at the same time as we are seeing in so many economies in the West, also in emerging markets, rises. We see the rise of, for example, food prices, no? And the average expenditure of the citizen is actually going up despite the fact that we see headline CPI coming down. So to me, it's a very, very dangerous experiment, because once the economy opens, The headline CPI is going to show that overcapacity that has been built coming to the market and generating deflationary pressures on prices. Governments will interfere even further with big stimulus spending in order to try to get a little bit of employment back in the economy, despite the fact that that is not going to generate a lot. And central banks will continue to inject liquidity, which will be hugely inflationary on asset prices. It's already hugely inflationary on sovereign bonds. And then what it can create is the opposite effect, that the economy stalls into stagnation while inflation starts to creep up. Commodities start to go back up, food prices go back up, and central banks continue to, unfortunately, stimulate the economy the wrong way. Because if what you're trying to achieve is inflation, you are going to get it. The problem is when and how, and that is the to me the biggest challenge.
But why this mania against deflation? When times are good, as they have been, at least ostensibly on paper for the last 5 to 7 years, central banks and central governments try to stimulate demand. Demand. Now that things go south, they try to stimulate demand just more. In other words, it seems like they've just got one policy.
Well, I always say to my students that this is like governments and central banks driving a Lamborghini, which is the modern economy, with the instructions of a Ford T. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to generate inflation that would reduce their debts, but the inflation that they're generating does not reduce their debts because most of the liquidity is going to massive deficit financing. And by incentivizing current spending and incentivizing overcapacity, you don't get the kind of inflation that, as a government, you would like in order to reduce debt in nominal terms. So to me, the big challenge here is not just the desire to create inflation, but the obsession against disinflation. I always ask people, who in the audience, who of anyone that is watching us right now has ever gone to a service station and said, I cannot tolerate this, gasoline prices, gas prices are down? Who has ever gone to a supermarket saying, this is unbelievable, food prices are down? Nobody. The consumer has never felt any negative effect from disinflation. Yet, the average consumer and the average worker does suffer a lot from government-led inflation. Why? Because the formula that we create inflation and wages will increase with it is completely ludicrous. Real wages don't go up with the inflation that governments create, and therefore the worst off out of the inflationary measures created by governments and central banks are actually the alleged ones that will be helped by it, according to Keynesians, which are the salaries and the savings of the average citizen. That's why inequality becomes such an issue.